people are realizing colonialism isn't a concept, that it's a material experience. And so people are waking up to that and seeing from that perspective, hang on, let me just trace the roots here. I'm not just focused on the people who are resisting. I can also flip this and see that actually colonialism is also a felt experience, right? Not just decolonialism. It's not just about the resistance fighters. Hang on a minute. Let me just turn that around. Now I see the root. Now I see where this traces back to, which is why you're seeing so much large scale resistance in Europe, in the UK, in the US.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Lisa Minerva Luxx. Luxx is a poet, playwright, essayist, and political activist of British and Syrian heritage. Their work has been broadcast on Channel 4, BBC, and TEDx, and between writing, Luxx guest lectures on revolutionary politics and queer theory. This is my second time interviewing Luxx. The first was right at the beginning of this podcast, and I will put links to it in the show notes. I contacted them to record an emergency episode about the violence and resistance in Palestine. And this is truly an extraordinary episode. We discuss language, liberation, resistance, sabotage, violence, humanization, dehumanization. We discuss the symbols and linguistics of war, of resistance, of humanity, of dignity. We discuss the geopolitical context of this violence, the reality of empire, how the illusion of progress is being shattered in the face of unequivocal support for bloodthirsty violence, the desecration of homes, and the dismissal of human rights. We talk about this being a moment that is uniting people across the world and how everyone can get involved. From direct action to striking to comporting yourself with dignity and finding a way to support every other human being's right to a dignified life. This is the first emergency episode on Palestine that I will be releasing over the course of the weeks or months. I believe that first of all, the first thing that we can do is bear witness, and that second of all, the thing that we are witnessing is the culmination of colonial and imperial policies. It is a gut-wrenching thing to see violence, international violence, state violence, played out real time with full support from quote-unquote democratic regimes. Understanding what is happening in Palestine leads us to understanding more of what happens in our own lives as well at the hands of those same regimes. Whilst that is deeply important considering the urgency of the climate crisis that we are in, another reason I'm doing these emergency episodes is because the ecosystem of Planet Critical was built with people platforming one another, and against the deluge of PR, of propaganda, of two-dimensional analyses, Planet Critical will be a platform for the voices of those who are silenced, those who dare say something different, those who damn well know what they're talking about, quite frankly. These emergency episodes will come out every Sunday. There will be writing alongside them. I've already had subscribers drop out since the last episode, which was simply with a researcher about disinformation in the Middle East. And I've had personal emails, some fairly vitriolic, since criticizing the Israeli state, the Zionist regime. To anybody listening who feels outraged or upset at these episodes, please know that I am genuinely curious as to why you feel that way. That this is a space of learning and deconstructing and collaborating. If you can also find it in your heart to be curious, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. But first of all, I implore you, please just listen. Listen to some other voices. Listen to those who have embodied experience of this level of violence. Listen to those who care about constructing a better world. Listen to those whose hearts are breaking along with yours. And remember, what could unite us are our commonalities rather than our differences.
I'm trying to remind people, especially those who are using pinkwashing as a way to pit you against Hamas and Palestinian resistance fighters when you're a queer person, is to say you think that they wouldn't, and obviously they use the word behead, because they love Islamophobic tropes, you think they wouldn't behead you? I'm like, the fight for a free Palestine is a frontier where all liberation movements must meet, right? Like it doesn't matter actually to say these kind of nuanced things to somehow try and make me believe that I'm in the wrong fight because Israel have managed to cleverly put out a PR machine that makes us believe that it's democratic and everybody's equal there. Of course they are not. Hence why we're in this situation. Why I believe that Palestine and the fight for liberation there is a frontier where all of our movements meet is because it is the most clearly defined frontier against colonialism right now, against white supremacy. You can't speak about climate injustice without talking about white supremacy. You can't speak about queer liberation without talking about white supremacy and colonialism. You know, these things all feed into the same, or come from, let's say, the same root, the same rhetoric, the same dialogue that was set up by white supremacists and the emergence of that hand in hand with capitalism since the 1600s. That's why there are so many oppressed groups like now that look the way they are, feel the way that they are, is because of those same mechanisms of oppression. And that is just the most potent, and I don't say symbolic in terms of it being an empty symbol or being so much more than that, but you can look at this liberation movement as a symbolic every other liberation movement that's happening, and the way in which you will be persecuted. I'm not saying lightly or with flippancy. Let's say I'm not drawing parallels flippantly here. I certainly hope that's not how it comes across. But look at what's happening with the trans rights movement in the UK. You're perverts. You're this. You're that. Because if you're perverts and you're less than human, then no, you don't deserve medical aid. No, you don't deserve to have supporters, etc., etc. You see the exact same rhetoric with Palestinians. You're human animals. You guys don't deserve to live. You know, that we can't separate these issues. You could start with your beginning if you want. Sorry, I know that you start in a certain way. I just felt that perhaps we should start
No,
our conversation.
please do not apologize. Please do not apologize. I think, no, I'd like to keep going. I think, as I was saying just before we pressed record as well, like this being symbolic for every other liberation movement, this being the intersection, the nexus, the like mother of all relationships between oppressed groups. It's so important to be understood like that because of the economic warfare that is happening all over the world. Like there is a them and an us, and without going into the semantics of like who in which group is like evil or good or these value judgments, like just looking at it as people are propelled by a system, and some people do their best to propel that system further. It is so important that the liberation, the right of a people to live in freedom and in dignity, that this be one. Because if it isn't, I mean, the precedent, it's been going on for hundreds of years, as you say, but the precedent of those people losing their freedom and their dignity forever, losing their homes forever on the world stage where it's being recorded and the international community gets away with it, the Western community, the precedent that sets for every other struggle,
Yeah,
it's terrifying.
there's two things that I want to say to that. Actually, my brain is really fried at the moment, so I'm just going to be making notes so that I don't forget things. So first, to just speak to what you said about dignity. One thing that we're seeing a lot of is images of people in rubble, and they're being shared quite widely. I'm quite conscious not to share images, no matter how much they affect me, such as the video we saw after the Al Ahli hospital bombing of the father who'd only managed to recover parts of his son's body.
Yeah.
And he held them in a plastic carrier bag, and his face just in complete stillness. There was nothing left to feel. And this was impossible to remove from my mind's eye, and forever will be. However, the reason I don't reshare or resist to reshare such images as that is because of this notion of dignity. And also, it's the truth that's happening. And when Palestinian people inside of Gaza right now are asking for us to share what they're saying, we must listen to. We must listen to this. However, there is no but to that. Their request is their request. And that is why I insist that we keep sharing. And there's no use for people who believe, I'm just not being vocal online. It doesn't mean I'm not doing anything. Well, that's fine in a general sense, but in this specific context, there is no unbiased media happening. And so the people of Gaza are reporting themselves to you online and specifically saying the one thing you can do is just share what we're saying. So there's this. Now, my resistance to resharing a lot of the videos that are coming out of the rubble is because I know that I have been places in England where when people learn that I am Arab, I live in Beirut much of the time. I've had one person once ask me, Beirut, really? I thought it was all just craters. I didn't know that
Oh my
Kingston
God.
lived there. Yeah, really. And so I know that there are people not that far removed from us, from you and I and our circles, who genuinely believe that Arabs simply live in landscapes of destruction and that that's where we belong. We crawl through the dust, our men being savages and our women weeping. And that's what we do, right? And changing people's perception to understand if you cannot imagine your neighborhood turned to rubble and dust, then you best believe it's equally not normal for anybody in the world to experience that. It is not normal to see your house, your home, your neighborhood, your hospitals, your schools in rubble. None of us anywhere have made a habit out of that experience. That's not business as usual for anyone, no matter how many times that might happen to yourself or your ancestors. It never becomes normal, should never. The second part of what you're saying about this being connected to so many different struggles is a friend of mine who is Syrian, lives in Beirut, and very much invested and involved in Palestinian resistance, said to me something really empowering the night that I was leaving Beirut. He said, what we're seeing all over the world is people protesting en masse, and their governments are trying to repress them. Let's use, for example, Egypt. We just saw Egypt in protest again. We just saw Egyptians back down at Tahrir Square. Do we remember the last time we saw this? This was a while ago. This was over 10 years ago that we saw this. In Egypt, nobody has dared to speak up. No one has dared protest since Sisi came into power, And yet we see them there completely defying the code of conduct that they have felt they've had to follow since the Arab Spring. We're seeing the same thing happen in Europe. People are rejecting the repression being served to them by their judiciary systems. He told me, and this would have to be fact checked, I haven't seen this, that there are some European states who are having to roll back the attempts at legislation they were trying to urgently push through that condemned pro-Palestinian protests, because they're realizing if they create that piece of legislation, they can't do anything about it because you can't arrest thousands of people at once. There just isn't room in jail or courts. They don't have the resources, right? So
Oh, fascinating.
fascinating. So what you're seeing is all over the world, people realizing, hang on a minute, are we more powerful than our governments? And he said, thank you to the Palestinians for giving us the opportunity to experience that. And this is something that we must keep transplanting, this feeling that we're having, this empowered feeling of absolutely not backing down or being fearful in the face of repression when it comes to so many causes that are linked with the Palestinian cause.
It is such a visual representation of white supremacy and colonialism. And it is also being fought with, how do I put this? Like the most gruesome and ugly of tools. I suppose when we think of a lot of colonialism now, we think of like economic colonialism, which is just as devastating to communities, but it's like slightly more subtle, isn't it? And it's about like economic bondage and all these kinds of things. Like what the state of Israel is doing to Palestine comes from a different century, and it reveals the wrath upon which empire was built. Which is why, yeah, I completely understand and support your statement that the liberation of Palestine is the sort of first struggle.
100%, and I think that's why we first messaged on the morning of the global strike, and I believe that because of what you said is why it's important for people to be striking. And now I'll come back round to this notion of sabotage as a basic weapon of insurgent groups, but I'll start that off by just saying that I often talk about the formation, and we have to see ourselves consistently in formation. What you hear a lot of, and I'm sure that you will, as much as I do, is people saying, I don't know what I can be doing. And because they see big, bold resistance, such as the smashing up of Israeli arms factories by the likes of Palestine Action, and they think, well, I cannot do that. So therefore, perhaps there's nothing I can do. Whereas my point is that wherever you are in this architecture of social structure, you will find your role. So when we talk about that in terms of, for example, direct action groups, I'll just go into the microscopic and then we can zoom it out. In the microscopic, yes, you have those who are on the front line who will take the direct action, which may look like the spray painting of the BBC after its biased headlines, to recognize it as a target that is implicit, that is complicit with the continued siege on Gaza now. But you also need the people who will pick up those frontliners from the police station, make sure they have a lift home, they have something decent to eat, and they can have someone to reflect with. They can get a blanket and some water and a cigarette, whatever it is they need. Yeah. And then you have the people who are more learned in the judicial system and legal jargon, who can work with those actionists to ensure that the trial that they face, if they do, is itself a site of resistance. So there is, I believe, no worth in seeing going to trial as a consequence of resistance, because it's part of the resistance itself. It's a space to use Freedom of Information Act to expose companies who are trying to accuse you and to accuse them back. It's a place to put the judicial system in a moral dilemma, right? So you have all of these roles when you look at the sustainable long-term goals as the overthrow of colonial power. There are so many roles within that formation. It wouldn't work if everybody was on the front line. It wouldn't work if everybody was part of the armed resistance, or if everybody was somebody holding film screenings. Both those things are important at once. And so that's how I zoom it out. If you're working in a corporation, even if you're working as a freelancer, the use of strike has historically been one of the tools of sabotage. And striking allows for the capitalist mechanism, because you can't, since England entered the game, at least, you can't talk about colonialism without capitalism. And so in order to put a spanner in the cogs of the machine is to slow it down. I've cancelled all of my work now. I spoke to my agent. I said, you need to tell everyone who's tried to commission me everything that I've committed to, that I'm not doing it right now. Unless they can turn up for Palestine and I'll do something with them in tandem with that. There's no use in me doing anything else. I don't want to, and it's not right to. And so I can do it as somebody who is entirely self-employed and who works for themselves. If you work inside a corporation or you work inside a bigger machinery quite directly, then striking or slowing down your efficiency is a really useful way of sabotaging the machinery that's at play here. And hopefully there'll be more global strikes and more people will join, and even more organizations will close down for the day. Let's look at South African apartheid. People still have a common collective gap in memory, where they continue to believe that Nelson Mandela was always nonviolent. He always believed in nonviolence. He didn't. He did for a while. Until he realized it wasn't going to get anywhere. And then he went to Algeria to train in guerrilla warfare and started to employ tactics of sabotage, because it was the only way to actually disrupt the colonial power that was at play. And he knew that. This is a man who simultaneously was president of South Africa while remaining on the terrorist list in the US, despite the US by that point having moved towards sanctions on South Africa. They still kept him on a list of global terrorists, right? Now, he believed in sabotage, and it was, of course, sabotage that got him imprisoned for all those years. I'm part of Palestine Action, which is a direct action network in the UK. Some of the work that I do includes arrestee support, prison support. And what direct action's key goal is sabotage, economic sabotage. So coming back to striking, if an organization won't strike, what groups like Palestine Action will do is force a strike. We'll shut down that company, that Israeli arms factory, Elbit Systems, that is functioning out of the UK and exporting from the UK. We'll shut it down for a day, 2 days more, 6 days more, and continuously do that. It's economic sabotage. Firstly, because it costs 30 to 50,000 pounds in loss of profit every day in which one of these factories is closed. Secondly, there's a need to hire more security, so they continue having to lose money. Not to mention the restoration of buildings and increased CCTV, etc., etc. The cost of going to trial. And then another side of the economic sabotage there is that Elbit Systems had a contract with Ministry of Defence in the UK, and a £280 million contract last year was dropped with Elbit Systems. That's a huge sum of money. Why was it dropped? Because actionists kept entering the factories. And every time an actionist enters a factory, Elbit Systems has to report to MOD that there has been a breach of security. And eventually, at some point, the Ministry of Defense have to turn around and say, it's no longer sustainable for us to keep working with you when you keep having to process breach of security. It's not safe for us.
Wow.
So we have to cut ties. And there goes a huge multi-million-pound contract. Now we've seen historically sabotage work as a tool of insurgents that's more often than not been associated with anti-colonial movements. And so to believe that that isn't useful right now is to believe in the passivity that most anti-colonial leaders gave up on at some point. You know, you can't remain passive, whether it is striking, whether it is sitting down, whether it is taking 5 hours for you to do a 5-minute task for your boss, because that is your resistance, or whether it's blocking the entryway to businesses so that you force it, right?
This is so interesting because this is exactly kind of this is a big part of the conversation that's happening in the climate movement right now. I think especially sparked by Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and him asking the question like, why is this not happening? If this is an existential threat, and if this has also been the cornerstone of every anti-colonial struggle, a radical flank. And I think he referenced ANC, who actually part of their sabotage was fossil fuel infrastructure. Pipelines, blowing up pipelines, because empires can't run without fossil fuels. Empires will never run on renewable energy, people, which is another reason why they're very, very, very slow to transition. You cannot have a military on renewable energy. That military is only ever going to be fossil fueled. That's why the United States is terrified of the dawn of the new age. And there's this big kind of like back and forth around, oh, but can you create a good world using, can you create a non-violent world if it comes from violence? And a big part of the work, it seems, is like parsing all of these terms. Like, is sabotage violent? Like, is it? I don't know. Well, I know what I think. Is impacting a business or a pipeline or a piece of infrastructure, can I commit violence against a non-living thing? I don't think that I can, actually. I don't think sabotage is fundamentally violent. Especially if that thing is like feeding into the economy of death, but that's another like sort of stone. Do you know what? I was talking to somebody at the march on Saturday, and they're an amazing investigative journalist, do a lot of security stuff. And he was like, "Oh, obviously, like the climate movement has been infiltrated. All movements are infiltrated." And I was like, "Is that why this non-violence thing is such a big part of it? Because it essentially hobbles itself. It hobbles its own agenda."
Yes. Yeah.
Even this framing of, like, sabotage is violent. No, it's not. Give over. It's not violent. Like, sorry, I will shut up now.
No,
Um,
it's fine. I also just think that the conversation around violence, we become so distracted from the goal of liberation. Like in the PFLP, the strategy for the liberation of Palestine, written by the PFLP, so Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they wrote in their founding document, the only language that the enemy understands is the language of revolutionary violence. I said in some arguments that I had to face with Zionists following October the 7th. So if I was locked in a cage, or there was a person locked in a cage, or a people locked in a cage, which is exactly what the situation was and is, and you know that the only way to break those bars of that cage is to use metal cutters. No matter how many times you whisper and ask the bars to move and separate to let you out, they won't. And at some point, you have to pick up the tool that will break those bars, or you are choosing to surrender. And now there's a concept that came out of Palestinian prisoner movements, and quite specifically is a rhetoric in feminist praxis and feminists who were imprisoned. As we know, there's 20% of Palestinian people get imprisoned and tortured and interrogated. And I think that's actually quite a modest statistic, to be honest with you. But that's an accepted one. So I'll say that, so as not to be accused of inflating things. Now, this practice is called sumud. Sumud in Arabic means steadfastness. So it's in the face of violence, in the face of interrogation, in the face of torture, to not give up any of the secrets of the movement, any thing that is part of your movement's protection for itself, and to stay steadfast in that, which is also what I try and encourage in a much safer repertoire. Protesters or resistance groups in the UK to think with when they're facing trial. Never stand up and plead guilty. You're not guilty. What are you guilty of, my love? What are you guilty of? Oh, you put some paint on a building? That's arts and crafts compared to what the Israelis are doing to Palestine. Are you mad? Are you kidding? You're not guilty of anything, my love. Like, keep with your steadfastness, keep with your integrity. And if you lose sight of that, then root yourself back in the reality. Put your problems within their size, in the wider context.
I think we're going to have a complicated conversation around violence, given what we're talking about, because
Yeah.
some people listening to this are going to say, well, whoa, does that mean you're condoning that both of us are condoning the violence of Hamas? And there is violence, that's undeniable. So how do we square like the spectrum of revolutionary violence, I suppose? How do we find a language to talk about it that isn't binary and oppositional as well, right? That goes beyond, well, X did something, so Y did something, and all of this. Like, how do we? And even when so much violence happens in such a short period of time, and there is so much grief and so much suffering and so much rage, and all of that is correct, rage, suffering, grief. How do we peel back the big picture, the context that belies all of this? I mean, it's such a huge task.
I'll be very frank, which is, firstly, Palestinians have been lobbying, have been speaking at UN summits, have been educating the world, have been attempting peace and reconciliation, such as with the Oslo Accords, for so long. And it's gotten them murdered again and again and again. It's gotten them ethnically cleansed, which is removing dignity. What do you have left if you never existed? You don't even have a name. The one thing that we all leave behind is a name. And once that's removed, that is horrific violence. That goes beyond mortal violence. So, first of all, what we see is the emergence of Hamas. Now, I think that most people fail to understand that Hamas is an elected governing party. They're not ISIS. They're not popping up a group that goes around a number of countries and beheads children, as the West love to talk about. ISIS were horrific, beyond words, and I don't even want to talk about them because it puts chills down my spine. What we must remember is that Hamas are an elected government. They are a party. Yeah? So when people say they're hiding behind hospitals and schools, no, they have hospitals and schools because they're a governmental party with infrastructure. So there just are hospitals and schools in Gaza. Okay? So this is one thing that I think we need to have. If we're going to have a conversation around the nuance of violence, we need to have a conversation around the nuance of Hamas. Otherwise we are just trying to dampen out the urge for armed resistance. Now, we want to argue, is armed resistance okay? People who look back at the horrors of South African apartheid, American apartheid, will always see that there had to be, at some point, as the PFLP wrote, a language that speaks to the colonizers' violence. And that the only thing is violence, is revolutionary violence. I'm not saying here that I believe that there should be deaths and bombings. Bil'aks, yani the opposite. I wish that there didn't have to be. I wish that it wasn't at that point. I really, really do. But if you have to break out of your cage one way or another, unfortunately, it's going to come down to that. It's going to. That's humanity. Unless people surrender, and they cannot keep surrendering, because at what point will people care about Palestinian people? When they're extinct? Like the only time when we care about animals is when they become extinct. Not the only time we care about animals, but the only time you care about a rhino or something that's far removed from your experience is once they nearly become extinct. So we're going to wait until everyone's like, let's adopt a Palestinian and hug a tree. Are we waiting for that before you put any dignity on these people's heads? Do they have to be the perfect civilian in order to be worthy of resisting? They have, according to the UN conventions, the right to reclaim their land. They have that right. It is written in international law. Okay? Now, let's look, if we're going to talk about the nuance of Hamas, let's talk about how much Israel need Hamas. Okay? Right? There's a lot of text. There's a lot of arguments that say Israel created Hamas. I'm not going to go into that because I don't know black from white in that. And I think that sometimes this is a bit of I think this is a stretch, to be honest with you. But I'm going to just say that is an argument. That is an argument that's out there. Now, to temper that, what I do see and what I do observe is October the 7th, Hamas took hostages in the same way that Israel take hostages every day, every single day. Hamas took hostages. Why did they take hostages? So that they could bargain, they could negotiate for aid. What we have seen come out in the media, if you don't only watch CNN, if you watch a wider, broader spectrum of media, is that Hamas were not torturing people when they were taking them hostage. There was a doctor on site, there was a play park, there were things that ensured that those people weren't dying on their clock. That's not to say that Hamas have not killed people. Yes, they have. I'm not saying that they haven't, and I'm not saying that that isn't something that we massively want to be avoiding here, right? But let's look at Friday, last Friday, for example. We're now on Wednesday, 25th of October. Let's think about last Friday. When Hamas offered hostages back to Israel, they said, we want to release some of your hostages. And Israel said no, and they rejected it. Now, it is Israeli, let's say apartheid state civilians themselves who are condemning that their government is showing no care, no urgency to be there for their hostages, to recollect their hostages. They are even bombing areas that they know their hostages are. They're showing no care for their own civilians. Why is that? Because as soon as they get their hostages back, they have no excuse any longer to keep invading Gaza. They have no excuse. They have shown us now, they have shown their own citizens, which is why you're now seeing resistance within the apartheid state, their own government, saying, what are you guys doing? Why are you putting the land grab over the importance of reclaiming your citizens, you know? So it is a very fair observation for us to have the conversation that Israel needs a militant resistance group coming out of Gaza so they can excuse an extreme violence that is way bigger than what Hamas even has the resources to do. Keep in mind, Palestinians don't have a military. They don't have an air force, you know? They don't have that. They don't have those resources. They're not being funded by the US to have this training, to have those resources. The only thing that Palestinians can have is what we can call resistance fighters. It would be an army if they could have them, but the global community won't allow them to have it. So we think we need, if we're going to talk about violence, let's talk about actually what happens when you restrict people's legal rights to be able to resist in the language of warfare. It's going to come out in ways that we consider unacceptable. It's going to come out in that. I can say that I want nobody to be dying, anybody's hand here. Unfortunately, it's a little bit too late for any of us to be having that conversation.
Another strange and fascinating thing that's around the discourse of violence that has become very clear since October 7th has also been this partition between acceptable violence and unacceptable violence. And like the amount of political leaders that I've seen, make these statements around like the rules of war, the rules of conflict, how one is allowed to engage. And it's like, well, hang on, people. If nation states are created in such a way that they actually have rules to go to war because they assume that war will happen, and they have that kind of inbuilt violent mechanism, then surely we can assume then that the thing that needs the rules, the nation states, are inherently the most violent perpetrators of violence, the most extreme perpetrators of violence in the world.
Yeah.
Not people.
Quite. And there are red tapes often. I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that there are red tapes where negotiations are held between states where they say, we can bomb each other's areas within these red tapes. We can send missiles, we can pop, 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 right? And those are the red tapes.
God.
Right? That exists so that warfare happens as a conversation. You're seeing now between Israel's northern border and Lebanon's southern border that there is a ping pong. They're just shooting at each other's targets. Now, these are targets that are unfortunately affecting some civilians, but they are even more unfortunately agreed upon by the states and by the parties that they can fire within those regions, because that's how we say, I'm poking you, I'm prodding you. Hey, I saw what you did there. Hey, I received your message through that missile, but I'm just going to send you one back. That's what they do, right? There's those areas of red tape. Now, you cannot say that the whole of Gaza is within a red tape. It is absolutely not. And we can say the exact same for what happened on October 7th. What I would like to put as a question in people's minds is this image. In the 1920s, there was a horrific period within which the town that is now Izmir in Turkey had a lot of migrants and refugees, Armenians, Greeks. And there was a horrific incident within which the Turkish soldiers wanted to raze to the ground the villages and its people so they could rebuild on top of it. Yeah. So what it did to kill off all those people, to kill off all that infrastructure so they could reclaim it and get rid of all the refugees and the migrants, set fire to the whole thing. Yeah. To trap people in this burning enclosed space. And what's most famous about that incident is that whilst it was burning, there were both big ships off the shore where the soldiers went and partied and drank, played music, had sex, while the burning villages and screams were happening in the background. Okay. Now we can say, because this is historical. Oh, and by the way, we know this because it was the very start of photojournalism. So there are images. There's a lot of reporting that happened, which is why it was such a famous event, infamous event. Now we can say, because this is historical and we have some distance, 100 years, that is so horrific. And the moral, the lack of morality in that is almost incomprehensible. So I ask those people who can agree with me on that, how it then looks when you have what is an open air prison and what was originally called a active concentration camp. It was originally called that, Gaza, by an Israeli writer, an Israeli academic, was the first person to call Gaza a concentration camp. So let's call it that for the sake of this argument. You have a concentration camp. Why was it appropriate to hold a music festival outside a concentration camp? This I cannot fathom.
Because of the amount of dehumanization, I would imagine. In the same way that we live in countries where, well, I don't know where they are, but I imagine there's slaughterhouses actually not too far, right, from where I am, animal ag, and because, well, I mean, I'm not. Well, yeah, I am going to make that comparison, right? Slaughterhouse that's deemed as like non-living, not for food, non-animal, really, just product, not the kinds of animals that I engage with that are, bloody Labradors and whatevers. It's that difference, right, between animal and non-animal. And I mean, obviously you must not generalize because there's so much Israeli resistance as well within the state. I must not generalize, but from what I've seen, some things that I have seen, the amount of dehumanization that goes on, that the population are infected with. I mean, why? How could there be a music fest? How could teenagers be dancing next to such suffering and violence? Well, because it's not happening to humans.
Quite exactly. And we go back to this use of many people have been talking about and been horrified by, but not enough people, the use of these are human animals. And we heard this before with the persecution of Jews. How are we not learning? Jews were called rats, and that's why so many people allowed for the Holocaust to happen. Oh, but it's not happening to humans. I can allow it to happen to rats. I don't like rats. We allowed this to happen before. How are we back here? This is how it always comes down to. This is not about religion and never was. God bless all of the great voices that are coming forward from the Jewish movements who are saying, this is not the values of Judaism. This is a colonial value. This is entirely colonial values. This is being propped up by military regimes who do not care about religion. They don't. They just don't care. They just needed a foothold in the Middle East, and they needed an economic and military foothold in the Middle East, because it emerged just after the Ottoman Empire. They'd managed to collapse the empire, and the only way to stop such a powerful empire from emerging again in the Middle East was to disrupt it by creating the state of Israel, by allowing the Zionist project to take a land that wasn't the British people, the British government land to give. Biden saying this time and time again, if there wasn't such a thing as Israel, we'd have to invent it. We keep seeing that. He said it's the best investment America can make because it continues
to protect her interests in the Middle East. What are your interests, Biden?
Quite.
What are your
Quite, exactly.
What have they been for the past 15 years that you've been destabilizing that part of the world? Right. Could it be resource?
Absolutely.
Is this another colonial project? I mean, yeah, it's so, and I think something else, just the cognitive dissonance of like when people are like, oh, it's the land for a Jewish people. Well, Jewish people started to go and like now I'm not an expert by any means, but from what I understand, late 1800s, first of all, there were already Jews and Arabs and Christians living there in that region for a very, very long time. Always. And then some more, sort of an influx of Jews. And then came under, Palestine came under, Britain colonized and like took over. And there was like some more sort of immigration of European Jews into Palestine. But I read this thing that fascinatingly, so the Jewish people became more populated and started having a go at the British Empire there. And so they capped the immigration of Jews into, the land.
Yeah.
And even during the Holocaust.
Yep.
Even during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. So Jews who were under persecution in Europe were not allowed to go to Israel because the British Empire was bloody worried about having too many of them and that toppling their rule. So don't ever tell me that this was for the land for the Jewish people out of guilt. Absolutely. That was obviously not what it was for.
Absolutely. And I mean, so first of all, exactly like you said, in Lebanon, we still have synagogues that have now been disused because of the tension that's been created. We never created that. There has always been many different religions living side by side since forever in the Middle East, and you can see a graph of, okay, when was it the most populated by whom? Okay. And it's largely been the most populated by the Abrahamic religions and largely by the Muslim population for the longest amount of time. Also by Christians. There were small periods when it was more populated by Christians, very small periods when it was more populated by Jewish folk. Now, we were always living side by side. That was happening. I'm not saying that everything was always bloody harmonious and peaceful, but it's not in England, neither. It's not in America either, but it certainly wasn't a war against religions. And secondly, what I'll say is at the very start of the Zionist project, which, as you say, was well before the First World War, there was the original foundation of Zionism by Theodor Herzl. Now, Theodor Herzl wasn't initially particularly interested, as I understand it, in Palestine. He just wanted a land, a theocratic land. It wasn't about Palestine. They were looking at Uganda. That's where they were going to set it up. They were looking at various other countries. So to say that there is a right, as is used in the right to return to Palestine, is completely shot through if you just look at the history of Zionism. It was going to be a right to return anywhere. It was going to be a right to return anywhere. You can't just say, even, I'm a Syrian person. My father was from Syria, but I wasn't born there. So I don't go around saying I am indigenous to Syria, Actually, no, which is what so many Jewish activists are saying now. How come, what do you mean to say that all Jewish folk are indigenous to Palestine when how many generations have been living in Brooklyn? It's absurd, but I don't want to go too far into that because we may have already even gone too far. Because this provocation of this being about religion is what is flattening out the unity against colonialism. And it's just not fair to anybody. And it's particularly not fair to so many of the Jewish communities. It is so not fair to try and conflate Judaism with white supremacy and colonialism. It is not fair. And people who do that are not doing it in the best interest of whom they claim to be doing it for. They're really, really not.
Of course not. I mean, even since October 7th, the people that you have seen calling for, barring your activists, the next most reasonable group of people have been your religious leaders calling for a ceasefire together. Imams and God, you know what? I don't even know. What do they call the Christian ones? Priests? Vicars? I don't know. Them. And your Jewish community coming together and doing press conferences together, calling for the stop to the violence, calling for peace. You cannot tell me that the most religious people in the world are the ones that are like behind and like perpetrating this. Quite frankly, I just won't believe it. It's so obvious. It's so obviously geopolitical. It drives. I cannot fathom how people think it's not.
And going down that track, it becomes very clear that anybody who calls this a religious war is very anti-religion. I'm not anti-religion. I'm not. I don't believe that religion. And this is a very nuanced conversation. But there are people who take their religious scriptures in order to implement their own interests and values. It isn't foundationally the problem of religion, the way that human nature takes it on and creates problems from it. But to say that this is a religious warfare is to be incredibly undermining of thousands of years of Jewish faith and thousands of years of Islamic faith. And the Christians create a completely existential crisis for people who partake in this particular rhetoric. So there are many Christians living in Palestine as well. But people don't want to focus on that because it's existential crises if they start bringing that into the conversation. It really doesn't work with their binary. But it is to completely undermine the communities and the love and the scriptures that have been foundational to so much commitment and devotion that people have had, you know? And people who say that they say, oh, you know, this religious warfare, it's all about religion. They bring anti-Semitism into it and what have you, blah, blah, blah. It's people who are at their core so affected by Western media bias that they too believe that there is just fundamentally a problem with religion and don't understand that all warfare has consistently come from economic gain, has come through economic gain and land grabbing. That's it.
Of
Which
course.
is what all we've seen for
Of
hundreds
course.
of years, you know.
Of course.
And also the language around war as well. You know, we must remember that what we call as anti-colonial people, as people who are anti-colonial, let's say, because I don't want to just say activists, because that sounds very strong. And there are folk who believe in decolonization everywhere. They don't have to be as vocal necessarily as you and I are about that, right? Now, if you are in the decolonial sphere and understand decolonialism, then you would refer to the Algerian Revolution, where they overthrew the British colonialism, as the Algerian Revolution. The French still to this day call it the Algerian War. Yeah. And I think that this is very important when we start bringing in the word war. I'm sick of seeing the word Israel-Gaza war, Israel-Palestine war. War who? War who? When is that disproportionate? There is no war. You have to call it a revolution, a resistance, a huge, large-scale resistance has happened. And it has infected the whole world over. People are uprising across the globe in belief of the liberation of Palestine. And that isn't slowing down. That is absolutely not slowing down. Let's call this the big wake up.
It's so exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, terrible
Yeah.
that it has to come through something so violent. But maybe it would only be something so violent that would make it so obvious to so many people the reality of nation statehood and economy and white supremacy and all of this kind of stuff. But to see the images of people, whether it's, you know, Lebanese or Hezbollah, you know, because I saw this, Hezbollah's gathering, whatever, like people are gathering essentially, you know, in Iran, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Morocco, like all over the Arab world, and then all over the Western world as well. I even saw a march in Texas, footage, a huge march in bloody Texas of all places. You know, there's something just, it's so obvious how to be on the right side of history here. And it's so obvious that our leaders are not, and that therefore they are not leaders, and therefore they have a very different agenda, that it's doing something and it's unifying. Because my God, they have tried so hard to split us down with culture wars, right? Which is kind of the term that's been slung around for like the past decade, which is essentially just like the little brother of religious wars, right? As a terminology. And they've done that. It's been such an successful divide and conquer technique, that it even oftentimes made the left eat itself. But there's something so beautiful about this as well, because what we see is like people coming out for one another, not just for their own group, but for one another.
I think one of the most, that's very hard to gauge, actually. I was going to say one of the most moving things I've seen, but I think that is incredibly hard to gauge in this current time. Let's say one thing I felt quite excited about was seeing the formation in London of what they're calling the joint struggle bloc. So it's Black Lives Matter, SDS No Borders, LGSM, London and Gay Support the Migrant, London and Gays, sorry. Lesbian and Gay Support the Migrants. You've called me London. Lesbian and Gay Support the Migrants, and a number of other grassroots resistance groups who came together, and they're ensuring that they march together as a bloc. Joint struggle bloc, it's called. I haven't seen, and perhaps it's just me, but I do believe I've been speaking quite extensively with other anti-racist activists and saying I haven't seen prior to this the emergence of coalition across movement happening in the UK for quite some time. Now, when you start to see coalitions, you really start to see hope. I hate the word hope. I think it's really empty. I don't think it means anything. I prefer the word faith because it's more rooted in reality. Faith is something you practice in your body. Faith is engaging in a free Palestine every single damn day. Hope is just, I hope that I hope they're all right. So I don't really like the word hope. Well, I'm started to get a bit more in the past, maybe just 24 hours. Um, yeah, the joint struggle bloc has been a coalition that has emerged, and it's exactly like you're saying. And what people are doing, what you're seeing mostly across the Arab region as well, including in Lebanon, is protesters are protesting the US embassies. Yes, the Israeli embassies, but many of the countries don't have an Israeli embassy because they never did normalization with Israel. And I condemn those that did. But what they're doing is they're turning up to protest at their American embassies. And to me, that is so emblematic of people turning up to overthrow colonialism. They know exactly what the source is.
Yeah. Yeah. To add to that as well, that night when the hospital was bombed and we saw those images of the huge influxes of people all around the Arab world to the center of their cities, another embassy outside of which they were protesting was the French embassy.
Correct.
There was, I can't remember in which city it was, but it was that exact same thing of like, yes, we know the history, we know the problem, we know what it represents and where its heart lies.
Yes.
I thought it was beautiful.
Completely agree. And I think as so many decolonial voices have said since 7th of October, people are starting to finally realize that decolonialism isn't a theory, but it's a practice. And that means that it gets ugly sometimes. Historically, decolonialism has never happened without large-scale resistance and without sacrifice. So people are finally seeing this. I think what you've been getting at in this conversation is the exact same the other way around. People are realizing colonialism isn't a concept, that it's a material experience. And so people are waking up to that and seeing from that perspective, hang on, let me just trace the roots here. I'm not just focused on the people who are resisting. I can also flip this and see that actually colonialism is also a felt experience, right? Not just decolonialism. It's not just about the resistance fighters. Hang on a minute. Let me just turn that around. Now I see the root. Now I see where this traces back to, which is why you're seeing so much large scale resistance in Europe, in the UK, in the US. How long did JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, occupy Congress? I didn't see when it ended, but I was watching it for a number of days while they were there, and then I think it's when I was traveling. I'm not sure if they're still there or exactly what the end to that was, but I'm sure it is not the end. They're an incredible group, and people are going to the source and saying no. And this is something I as a British citizen, that I believe very strongly, which is that we have a responsibility because there is so much blood on the hands of our political leaders. And I say our with speech marks. There's so much blood on their hands that it is crusting under their fingernails. And it is our responsibility as citizens to challenge that and to dissent from that citizenship. And why do I mean dissent from citizenship? Because your citizenship is a social contract between you and your government. That's what it is. It's a social contract. It can be broken from both sides. It is broken by these governments of our countries, when they commit atrocities in our name and with our money, that social contract becomes broken. We didn't agree to that. So simultaneously, I can turn around to them and say, well, I too can break that social contract and I can dissent from citizenship. And I can also decide that I'm no longer going to listen to your laws. If you won't listen to my laws of morality, why should I listen to your legislation, actually?
Yes. There's something so important in that. I love this image that you're using of like turning the lens. Um, because I love how I wasn't expecting this conversation to do all of this with regard, but because it's all also about the climate movement as well, like because that's another liberation movement from this economic paradigm and colonial powers and all this as well, and something that I've been sort of banging on about for the past few months on this show and in conversation with anybody who will listen has been protest, like out on the street protesting, asking, demanding even, but asking, not enough.
Mhm.
Coming out with the solutions, not enough. Like you need to turn the action to focus on the problem as well. We need to start uprooting
Yeah.
that thing that is causing all of that violence. Otherwise, it won't work. None of it. Otherwise, the best that we're hoping for is essentially collapse and have the nets ready, some nets ready to catch people. But it is not. And I said, I even said this to venture capitalists recently, believe it or not.
Yeah.
For some reason, they wanted to speak to me. And some of them were like, what should I be in? Like, what should I be like investing in? I was like, you should be investing in activist networks
Mm-mm-mm-mm.
because those are the people that are pushing the reality that makes the legislation necessary that's going to make you bucket loads of money from investing in bloody solar panels or whatever it
Yes.
is. Like it's part of a diverse investment strategy. Like you have to.
Yes.
If you have to get the people, you have to support the people who are doing the work to undo the actual structures of power.
Yes.
But certainly within the climate movement, there has to be so much more actual undoing. And I think that I mean, you've seen that, and I know you'll have seen that, those images of during the March of Return
Yeah.
in Palestine over that year and a half when they marched and marched and 200 peacefully towards the border wall, and 200 odd were shot dead by the Israeli foot. It was a peaceful march, everybody, men, women, children,
Yeah.
and it didn't work because power, as we have seen, has no interest in giving back, no interest in giving up. And in that last century, when things looked like they were going a little bit better, progressive civil rights, good for women, good for people of color, good for LGBTQ community. Actually, what was happening was they were exporting all of that terror elsewhere to other communities. They realized they didn't need to extract from their own populations; they could go and extract elsewhere, thanks to globalization and thanks to capitalism. And now it's coming home. Now
Yes.
it's coming home. There is no 20th century in which it's possible to march and be heard. That was also through a very specific material condition of other people being exploited and extracted from.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
you have to focus on undoing power.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
And that there's so can I get like so many things I want I want to share back with you because you're completely right. And first of all, the climate change being rooted once again, and the class struggle being rooted in the
Mm.
Palestinian Liberation Front can be emphasized by the Israeli state's insistence on tearing up the olive groves and the land,
Mhm.
the farmland. So many Palestinian families, uh, in fact, you could say all, originally come from, that's a massive generalization. I mean, I'll say that. Let me say Palestinian culture is rooted in agriculture. So much of it is rooted in agriculture. You see the kassiya, the scarf that people wear. Within that, part of the pattern on that references the olive groves. And then what you
Mhm.
see is uh, the Israeli state setting fire to those olive groves and tearing them up because not just because they want to build buildings on them, but also because they want to remove any sign of ancestry to the Palestinian people.
Mm.
And those olive groves are an existential crisis because they grow for hundreds of years. Yeah. So
Yeah.
one thing that has always been, at least from my reading and studying and engagement throughout the course of my life, one thing that I have seen is that revolutionary statements, founding papers, and writers and voices from Palestine always go back to the land. They always talk about the reclamation of their land, having resistance until victory while our feet are rooted on the ground of our land and while we can still grow our own food. It is a localized economy and it has remained so, you know. I think that that is something incredibly important when you look at the Palestine, both the occupied territories, 48, and historically, what you see is a lot of agricultural space and a lot of farmland, right? It's a class struggle, it's an environmental struggle, as well as it being, or because of it being a colonial struggle as well. And in terms of how we deal with these crises and marching and asking the powers that be to amend their legislation, to amend the way in which they're treating the global south. What's his name?
Akomalafi.
Bayo Okomalafi, I love this guy. He talks about how the way you deal with the crisis is largely the crisis itself. Right. And it comes back to these guys who are telling me about these investment bankers, whomever. Guys, actually, maybe continuing to think in terms of investment isn't necessarily the way forward. Yeah, I don't want to hear invest. I don't want to hear growth. I want to hear divest, and I want to hear localize. Kalas, shush, shush. You know, just sit down. That's what we need you to do. We need you to sit down and shush. It's just all I need you to do. Yeah? Just you can't solve it with the same mentality that you created the problem with, you know? So then what also Okomalafi talks about is the trickster energy, right? This is his famous offering, this idea of the trickster energy. And we're seeing that when we see, for example, did you watch Bassem Youssef talking to Piers Morgan?
Yes, I did.
Right, I watched it about 5 times. Why this was most effective is because he kept flipping the script. His trickster energy was so effective in saying, I agree with you. I agree with you. You're right, Ben Shapiro, smartest man in the world. And so I asked him, what is the currency, of life? And he brings this trickster energy that makes it impossible to disagree with his argument. He's leaving no space for disagreement. And it's through that trickster energy. And finally, in terms of not asking, when have we ever seen change that we asked for? Look at it. Okay, let's take this out of Palestine. Let's look at the LGBTQIA liberation movements. You think that happened magically? No, a brick was thrown. Stonewall was a riot. Tell me again that we don't need violence. I beg you, tell me again we don't need violence. This is not me calling for violence before I get a knock at my door, but probably I'll get the knock at my door anyway. Whatever, the knock at my door is coming. There's no way of us avoiding at times like this, looking back historically and saying, but what worked? What stopped violence? And sometimes it was a new punctuation mark of violence. It was a brick through a damn window that started the Stonewall riots that changed things historically for LGBTQIA people. So I now can live my life in England, and not that that's violence free as a queer person. It's a hell of a lot closer to it because a punctuation mark was created through a brick and a window.
That is so beautiful, luxx. A punctuation mark of a brick through a window that punctuates the regime, right? That's what that kind of act of sabotage does. And it's not. And this is the other thing that I think about quite a lot. Is like, people are so quick to decry that kind of sabotage or any kind of violence. It's like, God, we're so lucky that there's not more between, like, the oppressed in the world is the majority. We can all agree on that, right? The majority peoples in the world are oppressed. It is amazing that there is not much more resistance. And frankly, if there were, how do I put this? If people were inherently violent, if they were inherently violent, this wouldn't exist in the way that it does. It's because people are not inherently violent, because they don't want to have to be violent, because they are kind and compassionate and they think about the long term and they think about the consequences of their actions, that the oppressed haven't just like burned the whole place down.
Right.
You know, because people are living in community, they are embodied in their suffering together. And I think that is a massive problem in sort of your more quote unquote developed economies. We've been so atomized and individualized, and our trauma has become so invisible. We all like suffer it individually because of the way that life is set up, that actually it makes that fracturing of like a communal response more difficult. And I think probably, I'm totally riffing here, I've never thought about it until this exact moment, but that might also explain these kind of like violent outbursts from certain groups, like in the United States. Like, why is it that mass shootings are on the up?
Yeah.
Why is it? Well, because people are not well. And why are they choosing that? Well, they're not embodied in community. There's like, I'm not saying there's nothing else for them to do. Of course not. I'm not condoning that in any way. But it is something that they can do.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of mass shooting, just to respond to that, it reminds me of what Bassem Youssef said on the Piers Morgan show, which was when Piers Morgan, which is a hilarious question, the irony just is beyond itself sometimes. He said, "What would you do if you were Israel?" Bassem's like, "If I was Israel, okay, let's play this game. If I was Israel, okay, this is such a weird question. What would you do if you were the Israeli state?" Anyway, Bassem Youssef says, "I would do exactly what I've done because the world is letting me, because I can." Right? And it's that. Anyway, don't want to spend too long on that notion, but in terms of this, we went very close to this idea of folk who believe there is a way to bypass in climate change movements, in anti-colonial movements, in trans liberation, queer liberation, that we can bypass these big moments of resistance that include modalities of seeming violence, right? Such as a brick through the window. And there are these same people who I'm seeing post since October 7th. Let's imagine peace. My friend, we've been imagining it. We've been planning it. We've been reading books. We've been having discussions. We've been organizing around it. But peace doesn't come from sitting and chanting together. Peace has to come first through the yin yang, through a moment of darkness, right? This is one of the rhetorics that is bothering me the most. You can't just imagine peace. And then also, it's those same people who are not imagining peace. You're not doing anything to imagine peace. You're using a phrase that's very easy to use. And if you imagine peace, if you truly want peace, then you have to plan for it. You have to organize. You have to bring together communities. You have to have hard discussions. You have to consider notions of where the line is, what is too much, what is not enough. You know, you have to collectively organize mutual aid. You have to do stuff. It is an embodied knowledge. You know, I have had one person, I don't even want to give them airtime, but one of the most insidious people who've been in my comments since October the 7th, insidious, who is putting hate speech in everybody's mouth. These is somebody who is challenging the notion of free Palestine, right? And anytime somebody comes forward and says, "Listen, I can share resources with you if you like. Let me know if you don't mind me DMing you, because I've got some links that you might find useful if you're trying to understand like this side of things, where we're coming from." And this person just keeps putting words in their mouth, like saying, "I don't understand why you're calling for the death of all Jews." Yeah, my love, not a single person has said that in these comments. What you're doing is sick, is a sick type of violence. None of us would ever even imagine such a thing. Are you insane? We are people who don't want to hurt anybody. That is why we're fighting for a free Palestine, because we want violence to stop. And let me tell you something, Rachel. I looked on this person's page and guess what? They're a healer. They're a healer. They're posting all about peace and you can't write it.
I'm having a bodily reaction.
Yeah.
Oh God, there's something. Do you know what? I can't believe we're going here, but let's bloody go here. You're gonna love this. You're gonna hate this. I hated this. I was in some online thing, last week. Last week. Yes, like last Monday or Tuesday.
Mm.
So a week and a half, 2 weeks in to terrible violence, and a lot of talk around apartheid and colonialism and all this kind of stuff, and a white South African woman said that,
What? Go on, hit you with it.
you know what's going on here. She said that South Africa had hmm, gotten past apartheid and done well by love and light. That's how South Africa did it.
Oh my goodness.
Love and light.
Yeah, of course they did. Of course they did. Well, look, it's the delusion. It's a real felt delusion. And I saw somebody, and I wish I could credit them, but there's such a barrage of things that I'm taking in at the moment. And I think this was something that I saw in passing, unfortunately. If I remember the credit or I look it up after, I'll let you know so that we can make sure we credit them in any kind of description. But they were essentially saying there are people who are so ignorant to racism at large, and that being within in colonial movements, within climate injustice, in all these different modalities, within apartheid. They are completely oblivious to it, and they don't realize that racism is a white problem. Because as Toni Morrison said, if you can only feel big when you put someone else on their knees, then you have a big problem, and you need to figure out what you're going to do about your problem. And so Toni Morrison said that. Now, this note that I saw from somebody more recently was, I don't wish I was them. I don't wish I was that ignorant. I would rather be struggling with the agony of what we're feeling right now, because at least I know that I feel, at least I know that I understand humanity. At least I know that I have morals. At least I know that I have love.
Mm-hmm. Real love, not the love and light that is printed on T-shirts and signs.
Revolutionary
and
love. Nah, bring me revolutionary love. But revolutionary love or nothing. That's if your love isn't truly actively resisting harm and hate, if it isn't active, then it's not love. It's a slogan. I've been very frustrated at the use of abstract nouns, actually, generally speaking, since October the 7th. Like peace, love. Like all of these abstract nouns that people use, that they evoke to say absolutely nothing at all. And in kind of postmodern linguistic, you'd refer to it as the empty symbol, these empty symbols, right? These words or images that don't actually denote anything. They don't denote anything. There's nothing inside the symbol anymore. It's simply become referential of itself. So the word love in this context, or peace in this context, is only actually becoming referential to its own emptiness, to the word itself. When I think about the word peace right now, I just see it drawn in like these like squiggly, nice little illustrated font, a thing on a t-shirt or me, or a graphic. I can't actively use that word and imagine a physical felt experience, because nobody's trying to use that word to mean something. My partner had a tea yesterday, and you get these boxes of like pucker teas. And so there's like the peace tea or the sleepy tea or whatever. And she said to me, do you want some of this as a peace tea? I said, why don't we call it the Oslo Accords team? You know, like let's try and challenge these abstract nouns. Really, it's and it tasted terrible. I said it tastes like Oslo Accords as well. You know. Like the fucking
You
US
know, it's so,
resolution. UN resolution tea. Oh, it doesn't taste so good. What's it doing for me?
but
Nothing.
But so much of language now does exactly that. I mean, the COP agreements. What agreement? Absolutely, the word agreement means nothing anymore, thanks to COP.
No,
Quite frankly, these 28 years of this useless and negotiating. What? You're not negotiating. You're agreeing as well. Like, how do we make this somebody else's problem in the future? Like, I think. I mean, if you have time, I would love to talk a little bit about love before letting you go. Um,
sure.
and revolutionary love, because the linguistics of all of the oh, hang on, I've got a whole bunch of things in my mind. Let me try and start over here and
Go
see if
for
we
it.
get
Yeah,
over
yeah,
here. But
bring
like,
it on.
so this idea, even resistance and like the right to resist. There is another word for this that is more commonly used when it comes down to like an individual, and that is self-defense, right? And funnily enough, they granted it to Israel. Obviously, funnily enough, of course they did. But when we think about the kind of actions that somebody would take to take care of themselves, the metaphor that you offered, the image of being trapped in a cage with the bar cutters. The thing that I sometimes think about is if I imagine a woman and a child in a house, locked in a house, with a man that is beating them, and he has the keys, and to get out of that house, she tries everything, right? She tries begging, she tries pleading, she tries offering herself, negotiating, all of this stuff. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Also, another part of the house comes on fire, really sort of ramping up the urgency of the situation. And in order to get the keys, she realizes the only thing that she can do to save her child and herself is kill that man and get out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anybody that would begrudge that woman?
Yeah. Well,
After,
unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately,
well,
yes. Unfortunately,
well.
the media would write that as that it was largely her fault because she possibly rejected him, and that's why he was so angry. But absolutely,
Right, okay.
those who
Yeah,
have
she's
it,
lucky she didn't take a bullet.
yeah, like those with the sliver of morality. You're absolutely right. And I want to use a similar analogy that is used in court, and it's one that I used in my own trial. When I was convicted for pro-Palestinian resistance, way before any of this happened, because this persecution that we see in pro-Palestinian activists is not new. It's ramped up right now, but it's not new. It's just that more people are experiencing it, you know. And having been on the receiving end of that, there's a image, there's a metaphor that is used in legal speak to explain a defense. Okay, so one of the defenses. Let's come back to defense, right? And one of those is, do you believe, say, for example, you took action against a building because within that building, there was some horrific crimes happening, such as the breaching of international law through the creating of arms for a military, for a apartheid regime. Let's just say, hypothetically, if you took action against that building, then one avenue of defense in the court of law is whether you believe that whoever owned the building would have consented to you taking the action that you did had they known what was happening in the building. So the metaphor that's used to explain this by many solicitors and barristers and other bodies within the legal system is, if you see a house on fire, so let's talk about this from the other side. What you're talking about is a person's own autonomous right to resist in a time of urgency. Now, let's talk about this in standing shoulder to shoulder. Let's imagine this as transnational activism, what I'm about to say. Let's talk about this as transnational love. Yeah, let's talk about this as transnational allyship. I walk past a building. I see there's a building on fire and there is somebody in it. The only way for me to get that person out is to smash the window. Do I believe that whoever owned the house would have accepted for me to smash the window in order for me to potentially get his child out of that house. Yes, of course I would believe that. Yeah. So this is an argument of defense in the court of law. It's exactly as you say. You can't argue that you would look and be like, thing is, there is a fire and there is a child trapped inside, but I'm sure they wouldn't want me to break that window.
But private property.
Private property. I probably shouldn't break the window. They'd probably be very upset with me if I broke their window.
Yeah.
Gosh, no.
Yeah.
No. You break the window and you break the down wall and you break the barrier and you break the apartheid as an act of love. And that's why we continue to resist, because we don't want to stand outside watching somebody die in the flames of that violence. So we have to smash a window or two.
We have to punctuate the violence with love.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. And the other, sorry, I just want to talk about that as well, because we've talked an awful lot about the bold acts of resistance. So the moments of the paratroopers, the moments of the brick going through the window, Nelson Mandela's own repertoire of sabotage. We've talked about all of that. But what I don't think is talked about enough is the humanization of resistance. So there's Thomas Sankara is a wonderful example, I believe, of this, because Thomas Sankara, the first democratic socialist leader of Burkina Faso, revolutionary. He stood up at the UN summit and he talked about how him and his whole delegation rejected imperialism. And what was emblematic of that is, we don't need your cloth being imported. We don't need what it is that you're trying to send us. Every piece of clothing that me and my delegation are wearing is threads made by tillers of the land in my country. It is made by the seamstresses in my country. Yeah, this was a moment of dignity for him. This is how he showed dignity. And we don't need you. We make our own clothes. We don't need what you import. Now, when I researched more about the coup in which he was assassinated, and I believe it was in that same speech where he said, I bet before the next summit or then this next 6 months, I'll be assassinated for saying what I'm saying here. Okay, so the coup happens, he's assassinated. There is one surviving member of that assassination, one surviving member of his party, who gave an interview some time ago, but you can dig it out and find it on YouTube. And he talked about how there was a meeting being held at 4 p.m. And when Sankara arrived and they all began the meeting, they'd barely begun discussing what needed to be discussed when they heard gunshots outside and the demand, get out, come out now, come out now. And what Sankara did was he stood up, he adjusted his clothes, and then he walked to the door into his assassination. He knew what was happening. And I am less interested in the gunfire than I am in the straightening of the clothes and the dignity. And I think we overlook too often that in these bold acts of warfare, of violence, that interwoven into all of them is someone straightening their clothes and trying to move forward with dignity.
Because that is ultimately the resistance of anti-colonialism, a life of dignity, a life that is allowed dignity, a life that takes dignity, that is fundamentally anti-colonial.
Wonderfully
And so
put.
those very human moments, I mean, it's beautiful. Yeah, that is
Really.
absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I suppose a thing to ask everyone listening to this would be, what can you do in your own life that dignifies your life or dignifies the lives of the people around you, or that dignifies the lives of people very far away? How can you help create a dignified world?
Quite. Yeah, wonderful question. Are you actually asking me or are you asking the people?
I mean, I asked the people, but if you got an answer,
I think I answered the last
I think the last hour and a half has been an answer.
But I think it's a very good question to ask people in terms of activating their allyship. But let's talk about consistently about the end goal being freedom and liberation. And if that is too much of an abstract noun for you, then consider what dignity looks like for people who are being consistently oppressed and humiliated. What will it take for dignity to become what is associated with them, rather than these images that completely undignify a people, in which people can take on this notion of human animals and run with it and agree with it and believe that there needs to be the complete decimation of a population in order to run out human animals. What's the opposite of that look like? The opposite of that looks like globally an agreement that there is a dignity in the Palestinian people. And my God, is there? You've never seen a people so. I mean, I'm not saying you've never, but the will, the samud, the steadfastness to continue resisting and keep living with love and with care and with community. Oh, they show us how to be. We're simply in formation with them, and we're honored. It's an honor to be in formation with Palestinian resistance. Truly.
I've seen some amazing stuff. I've seen stuff that is actually even the language and I think this so speaks to it's a form of humanization as well, right? Because I don't know what a human animal is. A human animal does not exist, right? But I've seen clips of people, yes, standing in rubble that used to be their homes and speaking with such dignity, so eloquently that this is where they are, this is where they will stay. You can take nothing else from me. You cannot take my faith in God and Biden, Europe, and like calling. They know. They're not stupid. They know better than anybody what the reality of the Zionist regime, what it actually hides, empire behind it. And I find it incredibly moving that language can flow through people in such moments of grief in such a way to humanize them against all odds.
Mhm. And that strikes me as very relevant with Amy Cesar's discourse on colonialism, where he famously wrote that the only reason why Europe truly had a problem with the Nazi regime is because the insidious, poisonous violence which they'd been pouring onto countries outside of Europe for so long came home to roost. And the only reason they hated it is because their immorality had infected them so much that they had to look it in the eye. And that's why they tried so rigorously to stamp it out and historically find it so hard to talk about, because they had to look at a culture that they had created.
Mm-hmm. A very good point, I think, to drop in that it's a word we've used a couple of times here, and with regards to the Holocaust, it's important. Concentration camp. It's the British Empire that first created concentration camps. They were colonizing Africa and sort of deployed them as methods. The most violent and ugly states in the world come from certainly in this period of history. All right, I'm not saying for the entirety of human history, but for the last few millennia, is Western Europe is so devastatingly guilty.
Mhm.
You know, something that we emailed that I wanted to ask you about, and we might not have time, and if we don't tell me, but talking about decolonialism, something that I have seen a lot is that decolonial thinking has become this kind of darling of academia over the past, 10, 20 years. And a lot of academics have made pretty good careers out of this new theory. Um, and it's not something that I particularly follow. There's no particular academics that come to mind. But what I have seen is a kind of outpouring of really justified anger and disappointment and deception from activists, actionists, just people, that a lot of these decolonial thinkers have kind of run away when the theory has had to become practice and are nowhere to be seen. Can you speak to that for us?
Yeah, I mean, what we've been seeing, at least in the UK, I mean, for the longest amount of time, is academic institutions driving out Palestinian thinkers as well, Palestinian PhDs, Palestinian professors, and making it a hostile environment uh, for Palestinian candidates within the institution, let's say. Now, how people have managed to allow that to happen while writing their papers and benefiting from the concept of decolonialism is first and foremost completely beyond. Now, secondary to that is we very rarely use in contemporary times the phrase or credit of public intellectual, because largely speaking, public intellectual meant somebody who was active in political spheres, active in social justice, active in movements, who was also an academic and a scholar. There seems to have been this complete disruption or dislocation between those who think and those who act. Because it's very useful as well for governments and for regimes and for police structures to see those who are reactive, those who resist, and those who are insurgent as disconnected with well thought through intellectual movements. And which somehow, I say we, using that in the wider context of the royal we, have allowed that to happen and allowed the institutional thinkers to stay in the institutional space and the revolutionaries to be somewhat dislocated from that. When you see uprisings in a number of countries, in Palestine, we shouldn't look at this directly in Palestine, who are often the first to be exiled? The thinkers, the intellectuals, the writers, and the academics are driven out because if you don't have them being part of the social movement, then it's much easier to look at those who are resisting as they're simply working class idiots who are just trying to riot, who are just rioting. Working class individuals who are rioting. Look at, for example, the London riots that happened in 2011, how that was essentially deemed as a working class people setting fire to things. Now, that was completely disconnected from an academic rhetoric. Remember that. We remember that because England and its psychological warfare is so very good at doing what it wants to do, which is separating units of people and collectives of people and population. The academics have nothing to do with the people who are breaking through a window and stealing trainers en masse. But these are different groups of people. What you see in decolonial movements that are effective is that these people are sat in the same room. There is no difference between those people. There's no hierarchy between those people. It is one unified movement. So, of course, there is a frustration at academics who have been benefiting in their career from speaking on decolonialism. There's a frustration at that if you've ever been within the academic institution way before we even start to see the praxis at large happening in front of us on the global stage. There's frustration at that. Personally, I expected nothing more from them. And I don't blame the individual. I blame the psychological warfare that has separated us so that it is so hard for us to overcome that in order to create sustainable social movements. That is a very British thing.
Thank you so much for that context. I had no idea. And what is the act of revolutionary love that heals those relationships in this time, considering the damage and the trauma of so much psychological warfare?
Yeah, I believe that localization is such an intriguing in these contemporary times act of revolutionary love. Because when you look at localization, you generally speaking sit the baker, the butcher, the tech guru, maybe I don't know any of them, but the let's say the person who works in corporations, the office worker, the academic, uh, all in one room, and they speak, and they speak in a way that breaks them out of their cells. So it wouldn't just be me speaking with other revolutionaries, with other activists, with other writers, with other thinkers, uh, and what have you. It would be me speaking with the young man who runs a corner shop, and it was being able to overcome difference for the sake of forming a community that isn't based on simply on mutual social value. It's based on a collectivity for a localized interest or a localized sustainability. You know, you see it, uh, uh, you see it when local community, and you see it, yeah, no, you know what? You don't see it in a way in England that transcends class. That's what you never see. You never see that. You see it happening amongst working classes when they have to resist such things as housing evictions. And so people will come together that perhaps have much differences, but they come together to unify in order to push against uh, 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 the bourgeoisie, let's say. But otherwise, you don't see that. And I think a localization is incredibly, incredibly important. I hope that answers that.
Yeah.
But I think it's something that we must ask ourselves every single day.
The answers that I get through this show, so many people, like it's the same roots: embodiment, community, localization, even from a climate perspective, love, radical love, um,
Yeah.
anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, action. Like it's all just to bring us right round to the beginning of like the Free Palestine movement being the front line of the universal
Mhm,
struggle against colonial
mhm,
power. The answers, some of the answers might be a bit abstract now in their nature, and some of them
mm,
might demand a huge amount of imagination to endeavor and to create. But the whole point of that is that they're collaborative processes, they're co-creative processes, and there should not be a top-down dictate of what that looks like in each locale. Because my God, if there is one thing that makes us strong as people, is our diversity in our thinking
mhm,
and our possibility in our organizing. Like that is what makes any ecosystem resilient. And so as long as it is coming from that place of values which actually we universally share, it's been studied. That's not just a thing.
mm.
You know, we share kindness and community and love and the desire to look after one another.
Yeah, and exactly that in terms of collectivity, collaboration. You said collaboration, and that reminds me of to loosely paraphrase is pretty much this. One of the slogans of the Black Panther Party, which is "Your body doesn't belong to you; it belongs to the movement," and it's that idea of
Mm.
creating an organism. You know, I remember I said this when I stood trial. I said, "You can convict me. You can do what you want with me. We will never stand pal Palestinian resistance within the UK. So you know, do your worst. But it makes no odds what you do to me. It makes no odds if you remove me from the equation because this is an organism that will continue to grow and thrive. And that happens through us caring for each other. That happens through us expanding. Organisms grow when you feed them, when you bring in new entity, you know, and that's how it grows. I think that's an incredibly important part of it, the absolving of the self, the absolving of the individual. And what that looks like is sacrifice sometimes. What that looks like is overcoming the self, overcoming that discrepancy between you and your neighbor or the person who's as far removed from you as possible and seeing the organism at large.
Lux, this has been extraordinary, as always. Thank you so, so, so much for your time. There's a couple of just like housekeeping questions I want. So the global strike, should people still join? Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
And where can they?
Yes, is my answer to that.
Yes.
Yeah. Never stop striking. Never stop striking. It has historically been incredibly effective. And if you can't strike, such as the migrant workers movement in the US about 40 years ago, then do the slowdown where you become so inefficient to the organization and make sure that they know exactly why you're doing that.
Excellent. And what people do you want to platform essentially as people that others should go and follow or read or whatever? Also, we can do this by email afterwards and I can attach it to the show notes.
Let's do that because I don't want to miss somebody important. And I already have been putting together lists for people to share. So I can if people keep coming to me to ask such questions or ask for resources. So kind of, I've got them ready. So I'll forward that to you and make sure
Excellent.
that the best to follow are available and that they're all Palestinian, some of which are speaking from the ground and others which are speaking from embodied knowledge.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And my final question for you, it's the same as I think I first interviewed you 2.5 years ago or something mad now. But it's who would you like to platform?
Mhm.
And do you want to do that via email as well? Or do you have somebody in mind?
Do that by email because I'm like thinking of about 15 people at once and I don't know which direction to go in. So I'm probably just going to send you them all. Who I'd like
That's great.
to
Do it
platform.
like that.
Of course, Mohammed Al-Kurd is ideal because he's just become such an articulate voice on Palestinian resistance. But there's also so many other voices within the resistance that perhaps get less platforming than he does, and massively support him being widely platformed. But there are other voices, and I think drawing attention to those might. I'll tell you who you should platform. Actually, no, this is what I'm going to go with. Of all of the ones, I think that all of the reasons why I'd say the others would converge here, which is platforming someone from the Palestinian feminist network. Really, really, really recommend that. They're
Excellent.
decolonial activist network, and they speak on things such as climate as much as they speak on things such as decolonial resistance. They're academics, they're workers. It's a wide they're former political prisoners. They're writers. They're really, really artists. A very good bunch to be in touch with.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for everything that you're doing. It was amazing to speak to you again.
Yeah, and you, Rachel. Nice one. Thank you for being in touch again. Really, always invigorating.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.